A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
Growing up, Thanksgiving was my favorite holiday. It always meant a table overflowing with food, laughing family members, and the warm scent of pumpkin pie wafting through the air. However, this year was different. My family had grown distant, caught up in life's responsibilities, jobs, and whatever else life threw our way. I was living in a cramped studio apartment, scraping by paycheck to paycheck. So when my sister texted a week before the holiday to say she'd be hosting Thanksgiving, I was filled with a mix of joy and dread. I immediately assumed I'd at least bring dessert or contribute in some way, but when I asked her whether I should pick up a pie, she responded with a strange silence that pinched at my gut. Finally, she texted back, "It's fine, just come," leaving me in a pit of uncertainty. As Thanksgiving approached, I tried my best to prepare mentally. I envisioned my family around the table, laughing over stories from past Thanksgivings, feeling full and happy as I enjoyed their company. Then, I wondered if I could really afford to pitch in this year. I didn't want to seem cheap, but the thought of struggling to make rent mixed with the guilt of not being able to contribute gnawed at me. The evening of Thanksgiving dawned crisp and clear, and I arrived at my sister's house, trying to remember what it felt like for everyone to get together. As I walked through the door, a delicious aroma hit me. The turkey, roasted to perfection, mingled with the sweetness of cranberry sauce and buttery rolls. For a heartbeat, everything felt perfect, and then I noticed something strange. My sister had a pinched smile plastered on her face, and the guests, a mixture of my siblings and their partners, seemed uncharacteristically tense, the clinking of forks muffling the chatter that should have filled the room. I tried to shake off my unease and joined in, eager to dig into the feast. But soon enough, after a few awkward exchanges, my sister announced that a sudden rise in grocery prices this year meant that everyone would need to contribute, which was a strange proclamation considering how we'd always shared the burden as a family. It felt like someone had ripped the joy out of the room. Why did it feel like such a dire situation? I looked around, searching for supportive eyes or someone to break the tension. The shallow laughs only underscored the simmering discontent in my heart. Just as I started to relax, she passed around a collection bowl, glaring at me as if the responsibility to pay for Thanksgiving groceries rested solely on my shoulders. My mind raced, confusion clouding my thoughts. It isn't a potluck if you intend to charge your family to attend. The ambivalence unfolded further as she demanded we each pay an outrageous amount akin to what a meal would cost for a dozen people at a restaurant. I looked at my family's expectant faces. I felt trapped. My heart sank because I would have defended my point without hesitation had this not been my blood. So, I hesitated, caught between the horror of being labeled the cheap sibling and the truth of my situation that left me worrying about bills. Just as I opened my mouth to voice my feelings, a small voice from my youngest niece chimed in, asking why we couldn't all share the joy of spending time together instead of worrying about money. My heart squeezed painfully. I saw my sister's face go pale. I tried to shift the conversation, laughing nervously and sharing a silly story about being trapped in my cramped apartment, but it only felt like digging a deeper hole as my other siblings stared at me in disappointment. I could feel the energy of the room crashing and swirling around me. My pulse quickened, panic began to choke the air. I voiced a quiet AITA for expecting not to have to pay for Thanksgiving groceries. Trying to gauge the atmosphere. Unexpectedly, that innocent prompt lit up tension. "Well, maybe if we all pitched in like we used to, we wouldn't have this problem," my sister snapped, her smile long gone, replaced by a deep flush of anger. Before I could speak, the room erupted into a cacophony of arguments, voices tangled in a familial riot, accusations of selfishness, indifference, and entitlement scraping against each other like metal on metal. I recoiled, panic clawing its way up my throat as I desperately tried to understand how my innocent gesture had thrown everyone into chaos. I could have sworn I watched our family fracture in real time, the crushing realization that we had begun to care more about our pride than the warmth of our shared history drowning the last shreds of joy in the room. My niece started crying, and suddenly the world blurred around me. It felt like I was in a nightmare where nothing could be salvaged. I don't know how long I sat quietly afterwards as their voices echoed, part of me desperately wanting to bolt from that house, and yet another part wished to mend the fraying bonds of my family. I took a breath, willing to attempt a peace offering, only to have my sister shout that it wasn't about me, it was about the costs, almost as if she were trying to erase my existence from that evening. I watched as one sibling left in anger, the door slamming shut behind them, a hollow thud that lingered in the air and resonated deep within me. I can't recall how we finally settled down to the meal after that storm. Tension had wrapped itself around the uneaten turkey, the sides untouched, and we grappled through half-hearted cheers, the festive spirit sucked dry. After a painful pause, I left to the bathroom, desperately trying to breathe, and when I looked in the mirror, all I saw were the guilt-laden eyes of the niece I had disappointed, an image that would haunt me long past that evening. I stepped back into the dining room, shifting on my feet, feeling like I had stumbled into a family gathering less than ideal, a space that felt less like home than an echo of what we used to be. The atmosphere stank of resentment. As I murmured a quiet goodbye later, guilt churned, reminding me of people I loved, staring at their half-eaten plates riddled with an anguish that would linger, ready to haunt me as the holidays loomed closer. My expectations, rather than bringing me into the fold, had created a rift that would deepen and darken into every Thanksgiving to follow. All that remained was the question, AITA for expecting not to have to pay for Thanksgiving groceries. And in the end, the answer was unfathomably clear: it cost more than money to keep a family together. When my grandmother passed away, she left us with a trove of jewelry, each piece laden with memories and whispers of family history woven into their ornate designs, and it was decided at her funeral that her prized possessions would go to her favorite, my cousin Sarah, who had always been vocal about her longing for them. I was more of a quiet observer in our family dynamics, something of an underdog constantly overlooked, so when the time came to talk about the inheritance, I stood back, allowing the others to discuss Sarah's claims, her tears, as they painted a picture of the deserving child, the granddaughter her heart favored. But not long after, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface, a gnawing sensation that my grandmother would not have wanted to make that decision so neatly or so soon without considering the rest of us. I started looking at the jewelry the night after the funeral, each one glimmering under the soft light of the lamp, but it wasn't the sparkle that drew me in, it was the way they seemed to pulse with a life of their own, almost as if revealing stories only I could hear. The emerald pendant, my grandmother always said, held the spirit of protection, the silver bracelet twinkled with memories of laughter and mourning, and the pearl earrings, her most cherished, echoed the vows she took, binding family together. As the days passed, I sneaked out with the jewelry one evening to my grandmother's house, the winds howling against the glass like voices pleading, wearing a heavy weight of unease as I unlocked the door to her empty living room, the barren space feeling far too strange without her tender presence. I laid the items out on the table, compelled to remember each story, but as I did, the air turned thick, heavy with an electrifying tension that set my skin prickling. I whispered my grandmother's name, a desperate plea for wisdom, and suddenly I felt it, an icy breath against my neck, a presence so real that I spun around expecting to find someone, but there was only the whisper of moths tapping ineffectively against the windows. That night, sleep evaded me as I wrestled with visions of Sarah, her face twisted with disappointment should I fail to return the jewelry, yet my heart shuddered with the instinct that something wasn't right. Then came the nightmares. In them, my grandmother appeared, her ethereal face hovering above me, her lips chanted a warning I couldn't decipher, yet the urgency behind her eyes pierced through the fog of sleep. Each night, those dreams grew darker. I saw Sarah in the attic, rifling through boxes, her hands clawing at the memories I wanted to preserve. I felt a rush of anger, a need to step in, despite everyone else dismissing me as jealous or bitter, yet I was only following my grandmother's wishes. Days melted into each other, and I found myself ensnared in the tension of relatives crowded in my small living room, each eager to claim their share, everyone casting furtive glances in my direction, waiting for me to hand over what my grandmother had apparently promised to Sarah. I held my ground, aware that Sarah's eyes glinted in the reminder of friendship, tangled with loss, hers for my grandmother, and mine for the identities we were expected to wield as family members. As the pressure mounted, so too did the whispers. Rumors spread through the family like wildfire, accusations of greed unfurling over dinner tables, bitterness painting a rift between us. I considered surrendering the jewelry just to appease the storm of hurt feelings, yet around the same time, the jewelry began haunting me in ways I could not explain, strange occurrences swirling within the confines of the house, the lights flickering, objects rearranging themselves in the darkness, and echoes of laughter that seemed to originate from the pieces themselves. I couldn't help but wonder, did my grandmother bestow her earthly treasures with the intention of continuing a cycle, or did she craft them with the precision to repel tormentors like Sarah? Then came the revelation one stormy night when I sat in silence, the rain beating against the windows like a relentless drum. That was when I discovered the hidden compartment in the emerald pendant, the chill of the metal pricking at my fingertips as I worked to open it, revealing an old photograph of my grandmother in a flowing dress and a note, its edges frayed, penned with her delicate script, warning to keep the jewelry close, the ones who covet them may have intentions that corrupt. The moment I clutched that slip of paper, a warmth flooded through me, threads of connection stretching back through generations. The intent warned me away from surrendering the legacy she left behind. The next day, I finally approached Sarah, the sunlight splintering through dark clouds, making the moment feel almost surreal. I placed my hands on the table, grounding myself as I looked into my cousin's eyes, shimmering with tears and expectancy, and I told her how our grandmother would never have wanted this kind of animosity and entitlement stemming from love. Those gems were mine, bound through blood and shared history. The room fell silent, the tension sharper than any blade. I could see the reflection of other relatives in Sarah's pupils flip-flopping between support and a need for dissension, but something snapped inside me, and a fierce voice broke through, claiming our shared bond that had long been overshadowed by greed. Time froze momentarily, and to my shock, Sarah's expression shifted. Betrayal twisted her features, but then I noticed the shadows behind her, creeping along the edges of the room, a darkness that felt familiar and foreboding. It dawned upon me that I was not the only one who had heard my grandmother's pleas. The air thickened with disquiet as it dawned on me. I wasn't just defending some jewels, I was shielding our bloodline. Clutching the pendant close to my heart, I vowed to keep the jewelry not as a mere possession but as a guardian of stories that could not be tainted by envy or desire. I realized now that sometimes protecting a legacy meant making hard choices, forcing your hand against those you love, becoming the villain in their eyes to uphold the dignity of those departed. As the shadows receded slowly, I felt it, a quiet resolve wrapping an iron grip around my heart, knowing I was not wrong for resisting Sarah's claim but rather, I was right to protect what was more sacred than envy, our family. In that moment, the chains of our ancestral stories tightened like a noose, both a blessing and a curse, binding me to a fate I would uphold, in memory of her, against all odds, even if it meant sealing the very fate of our family. Last summer, my 6-year-old son Max came rushing into the living room, frame brimming with the triumphant energy only a child committed to an idea can muster, announcing he'd decided to get a pet snake, a decision I met with equal parts dread and challenge. Rewind a week, and I had let him watch a documentary about reptiles, telling him all the wonderful things about them, how they're silent, mysterious, and perfectly contained. It seemed harmless at the time until Max's fixation intensified, drowning out everything else until it became a daily ritual. He'd research snakes for hours, holding on to facts about their eating habits and habitat. Their sinister, hypnotic movements made him dream of becoming a snake whisperer. I was the one holding the reins on reality. Snakes create nightmares, don't they? We live in a suburb spattered with kids, and most of them had puppies and kittens. I couldn't imagine the looks I'd get from the other parents if they sporadically encountered my boy frolicking with a long, scaled creature in the yard, or worse, if it escaped into the neighborhood. Thus, I decided to inject some realism into this fantasy. I called a local reptile rescue and arranged a visit. The day arrived, easing my nervousness as I drove to the small facility where scaly creatures sat in enclosure after enclosure, murmuring secrets of the wild. My heart raced with a mix of excitement and dread, half expecting a Houdini snake to leap from its cage and fly for freedom. But upon entering, Max's eyes reflected nothing but awe. He glided from tank to tank, glued to the glass, scarcely breathing, while I stood off to the side, dread building like a storm cloud. Then it happened, he spotted a black mamba. The staff warned us, they weren't kidding, and it was terrifyingly beautiful, its sleek body glistening in the fluorescent light, an almost hypnotizing sight as it flickered its tongue in and out, tasting the air. One of the workers, noting Max's fascination, leaned in with a guarded seriousness. You know, they are deadly, right? I could sense Max's excitement inching toward horror, but instead of pulling him away, I decided to reinforce reality. See, Max? This is what I mean about snakes. They can seem mesmerizing, but they're also dangerous. No one should have one in the house unless they really know what they're doing. His sparkle dimmed, brows knitted together in confusion and disappointment. So we can't have one, Dad? My heart seared at the thought, and unable to meet his determined gaze, I replied, absolutely not. Just then, he turned on his heel, storming out of the room, the pent-up resolve of a child shattered with a single blow, and I thought maybe I had overdone it, but I nursed the belief that I did it for his safety, though a creeping guilt began to take root. We arrived home, and the atmosphere shifted, the air felt static, and I saw Max's face harden into a stubborn expression that told me this wasn't over yet. Days turned into a battlefield of tears and tantrums, him pleading for even a small, harmless snake, swearing he would care for it himself if I'd just let it happen. "Don't you trust me?" he'd yell, and my heart splintered as I struggled against an invisible wall growing ever higher. Then came the day that broke me. I remember barely holding together my nerves when Max burst into the kitchen wielding a crumpled sheet of paper he'd drawn upon. "This is me," he shouted, presenting a crude, bright crayon drawing that depicted him with a snake coiling around his tiny waist, a face devoid of fear, its smile matching his own. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just art, it was his way of coping, of becoming the snake charmer he thought he could be, and suddenly, in the moment of false triumph, the room felt too small. My breath caught as I realized how desperately he wanted to connect, turning a simple pet into a bridge to something bigger. "Mom and I have talked about it. Just trust me, Dad, I'll be gentle," he insisted, but I was rigid, turning his innocent plea into a fortress of rejection. "Max, it doesn't matter. I won't let you get hurt," I snapped, and there it was, the crushing realization hit me. In protecting him, I was breaking him, and the tears rolled down his cheeks, the paper falling like a forgotten dream as he staggered back. It rumbled, guilt rolled in waves through my head as I saw him flee, a small silhouette against bright walls, and seconds later, I heard the door slam behind him. I found him curled up in the corner of his room, sobbing softly into his pillow, and at that moment, every rationalization melted away. I wanted to apologize but felt locked in, trapped by my decision and the fear of looming judgment from everyone around me, including myself. We are parents, aren't we? We bear the weight of our children's pain and dreams, but I couldn't shake that feeling. I went to give him a hug, but he recoiled, wiped his face angrily, and spat, "Just leave me alone. You don't care about me." Over the next few days, that wretched guilt clung to me like a shadow, pushing my thoughts into darker corners. I tried to engage him in other activities, to erase the memory of that day, but he wouldn't have it. He'd draw more pictures, always involving the same snake, and I'd push it down, push it aside. Until one evening, while sorting through the junk, I stumbled across my college roommate's journal filled with ramblings about folklore and mysticism surrounding animals thought possessed by spirits. I got lost in dark avenues and old stories and discovered something I hadn't thought of in years, a legend about snakes and the children that could speak to them as if they shared a bond of telepathy. My heart raced as I wrestled with thoughts, and that night I couldn't sleep. I dreamt, or rather, I was haunted by Max, and in my dream, he stood with a snake wrapped around his body, looking at me with those big, watery eyes. "Dad, you let it take me," he said, his voice a fragile echo reverberating through the unmistakable serpentine coil. I woke with a start, panting and drenched in horror, an involuntary promise forming on my lips that I would fix this. I needed to make amends before it settled into something irreparable. I knew then that I had to find a way to show Max I believed in him. I mustered every ounce of will and landed on an idea. After all, he wouldn't let the snake slip from his soul, and I had no choice but to let him learn. So, weeks later, with trembling hands and a racing heart, I returned to that facility, but this time apprehensive hope guided my steps. I explained to the same employee about my son's growth, his unwavering passion, and an idea sparked. "Maybe you can help teach him," I ventured, "so that I can see him grow without fear." And I swear, the generous smile from the employee felt like a key. Maybe this wouldn't destroy my child but nurture a fierce respect instead. That weekend, I set everything up, asking Max to join me at the facility to unveil my decision. When I saw him, the wall of anger dissipated, and I whispered, "I found out we're getting you lessons with a trainer," and for a moment, pure astonishment lit up his face. The floodgates burst open as he threw his arms around me, sobbing with gratitude, releasing so much pent-up tension and fear. It felt like heavy weights slipping off my chest, and for the first time, we were back to where we belonged, but then came the creaking feeling of dread. A small, yet haunting voice within reminded me of how close it had come to breaking, and as Max reported how excited he was to learn proper handling, I imagined how close we'd been to losing everything. In the weeks that followed, I often observed Max in the lessons, seeing him step into an understanding that wasn't dictated by fear but by love and respect for the creatures that might seem unimaginable to parents like me. Yet, unease lurked in the air, that gnawing feeling grew as though the snake knew secrets we weren't privy to, and one night as I tucked Max into bed, I caught a glimpse of his crayon drawing sitting atop the bedside table, the snake at its center, smiling, almost sentient as if it held power over our world. A chill coiled around my spine as if it was vital to something far greater than us, and as I left his room, I couldn't help but wonder if there was truth behind the idea that some bonds, like love for those serpents, could also hold dangerous potential. I'm not sure how to start this without sounding melodramatic, but I need to share this before it eats me alive. My friend Danny, who, like me, is 23 years old, had been pestering me to set him up with my best friend, Laura, for months. She's beautiful, smart, and genuinely one of the best people I know. We had been friends since childhood, and after a slew of terrible dates, I thought, why not? On paper, they seemed like a match made in heaven, both love horror movies, the same music, and they both had quirky senses of humor. But every time I tried to broker this budding romance, something fell through. He would flirt with her one moment and then completely ghost her the next, and I could see how it hurt Laura when he'd vanish as if she were nothing. Finally, I confronted Danny about it. What's your deal? If you want to date her, then do it. Don't just toy with her feelings, I told him one night as we shared drinks. He shrugged it off, saying he was just busy. I didn't buy it, but I let it go, until the day they finally met up, a Friday night that still haunts me. When I got the call from Laura the next morning, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. He stood me up, and he didn't even text me to say he wouldn't come, she choked out between sobs, and as she recounted her harrowing experience waiting in that stupid cafe with her heart in her throat, I felt rage boil within me. Danny had let her wait for 2 hours before sending a text that something came up, which is code for, I couldn't care less about you. I spent the rest of the weekend comforting Laura, who couldn't understand what had gone wrong. She deserved better, and all I could think of was Danny's selfishness. The following week, I told Danny I was done helping him. AITA for refusing to set up my friend anymore after he stood up my best friend? I asked him directly, hoping for some sign of remorse, but he shrugged it off as if it didn't matter. He laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to echo in the confines of my mind, and that's when I noticed it, the change in him, something darker lurking beneath the surface. I thought it was just disappointment at being denied a date, but then things started getting weird. A few days later, Laura and I found a note on her car windshield, scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize, reading, "You should find someone who actually wants you," and it sent chills down my spine. I dismissed it as some random jerk, but then she began receiving messages on social media from a profile with no followers or posts. The person behind it clearly knew things about her that they shouldn't have, places she frequented and inside jokes we had shared. Each time I texted Danny, he ignored me or gave flippant responses that made my stomach twist. "My bad," he'd write back. "I've been busy." I had started keeping track of the odd notes and the increasingly menacing messages Laura was receiving. They grew more and more detailed, leaning closer toward stalking. I began to wonder if it was all a sick game played by Danny to get back at Laura for humiliating him by uncovering his true nature. But I didn't confront him again, fearing what might happen if I pushed. I was convinced he was somehow involved. They were intertwined in a twisted fate that I could no longer untangle. On a freezing December evening, Laura and I went out to grab some groceries, both feeling the weight of the ominous recent events. She pulled out her phone and went pale. There it was again, a message waiting for her: "You should really stay home tonight." The lights flickered above us as a sickening chill washed over me, and I could swear that a shadow crossed over the grocery store. Moments later, Laura and I split up to grab the last few items on our list, and when I turned down the cereal aisle, I noticed a figure at the far end. His back was turned to me, but his posture was all too familiar. Panic surged through me. Danny had been sneaking around while I wasn't paying attention. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough for me to glimpse his face, and I felt my heart drop. It wasn't Danny at all, but someone who looked alarmingly similar, a glint of madness in his eyes. I froze, the grocery list slipping from my hands. Before I could move, he took a single step toward me, and in that moment, the lights went out. All I could hear was the sound of frantic breathing and an overwhelming sense of dread. I bolted, screaming for Laura as I raced through the store, grabbing at the edges of my sanity. I found her in the aisle, her face ghostly pale, and she was gripping her phone tightly, shaking. "Did you see him?" She whispered, and I nodded, still reeling from the terror of being so close to something I couldn't explain. In the following days, I made the hard choice to go to the police, warily explaining the situation. They brushed it off, saying it could be a prank, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Then, without warning, Laura disappeared. One minute she was there, and then she was gone, spilling laughter and warmth into the world, and the next, it was like she had never existed. My heart ached, frantically searching for signs of her in her usual hangouts, social media, anything, and every night I returned to my darkened apartment, guilt gnawing at my mind like the predator it had become. I finally reached out to Danny one last time, hoping against hope that he would tell me where she was, but all I got was a deadpan "you should have stayed out of it." It was a message so straightforward it cut through me, and desperation consumed me as I tried tracing back everything that had happened. It finally hit me, every dark turn we took led back to him. I couldn't let it go, and so, the next Thursday, I found myself standing outside his apartment, too many unanswered questions pulling me toward confrontation. I knocked on the door. I didn't care if I appeared insane. The door creaked open, revealing him, a sly grin stretching across his face. "Thought you might come," he said, stepping aside to let me in, as if he planned this all along. When I stepped inside, the stench hit me like a freight train. "What's wrong with you?" I managed, feeling sick. There were notes scattered everywhere, torn photographs plastered on walls, the evidence of his obsession. I saw Laura's face among them, eyes wide in terror, and it felt like my entire world collapsed. He turned to me, eyes gleaming. "She made me do this. If you had just let me have her, none of this would have happened." I staggered backward in horror as he reached for something behind him. Was it a knife? But I dipped sideways, ducking and sprinting for the door. I burst outside, adrenaline propelling me forward, and just as I neared the stairs, I heard him call after me, a low chuckle echoing through the hallway. "See you soon." I never found Laura. The police still refused to believe me. Danny is still out there, lurking, with secrets that threaten to break through the cracks of reality. As for me, I live in fear every day that he'll find me, too, because I know what he did, and he's not done yet. So, AITA for refusing to set my friend up ever again? I guess I'll never know, as I am too afraid of what darkness lies within the heart of those you think you know. The truth is, I simply can't afford to find out. I never thought a simple visit to the grocery store would spiral into my own personal horror story, but that's exactly what happened last Wednesday evening when I encountered a mother and her 8-year-old son, a boy who, at first glance, seemed like your typical kid but quickly revealed an unsettling darkness. I was just trying to pick up a few essentials, milk, bread, you know the drill, when I noticed the boy running wild through the aisles, screaming at the top of his lungs, throwing items on the floor like it was his own personal playground. His mother was oblivious, seemingly texting distractedly on her phone while he sprinted down the cereal aisle, knocking boxes left and right. At first, I thought it was amusing, maybe even a harmless little tantrum, but as I watched him shove a box of Frosted Flakes into another shopper's cart, laughter turned to unease. The slap of cardboard hitting tile echoed in the empty aisle, and I felt the adrenaline kick in as he turned to me with eyes wide and wild, a twisted grin stretching across his face that seemed far too old for a child. I glanced at his mother, expecting her to at least scold him, but she just kept scrolling, her expression blank, as if her son's chaos barely registered. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of responsibility creeping in. I approached her, a knot forming in my stomach. "Excuse me," I said, my heart racing even as I attempted to remain calm. "I think you might want to keep a closer eye on your son. He's causing quite the mess." To my dismay, she looked up, annoyance flashing in her eyes as if I were the problem. "It's just a little fun," she snapped, rolling her eyes and returning to her phone, dismissing me in a way that sent chills down my spine. That grin from her son widened, and I swear I felt the temperature drop. Left with no choice, I decided to confront the child directly. After all, children respond to authority, right? "Hey buddy," I said, squatting down to his level, forcing myself to meet his gaze, "how about we help your mom and clean this up together?" His laughter echoed eerily in the silence, and then he took a single step back, looking me up and down with a knowing glint in his eye that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "You can't make me," he said, voice low and steady, way too serious for someone his age. I felt a chill race through me, a primal instinct to back off, but I pushed forward. "You'll get in trouble if you don't behave." For a moment, it seemed like my words had cut through the fog, and I could almost see the gears turning in his head. But then he just laughed again, this deep, guttural sound that echoed through the aisle, and I recoiled, suddenly feeling foolish for even trying. Almost as if the darkness inside him had risen to the surface, he spread his arms, as if preparing for flight, letting out a shriek so piercing it felt like it shattered glass. The commotion caught the attention of a nearby employee, who jogged over, eyebrows raised at the chaos unfolding before him, but as he stepped up to intervene, the boy turned and sprinted in the other direction, darting down the aisle and knocking over a display of snack cakes. In his wake, bewildered shoppers merely stared, shifting their bags and exchanging unsure glances. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I had no idea that feeling would soon become a reality. As the mother finally began to gather her son, I felt a tiny flicker of relief. Maybe she would see reason after all. But as she stepped closer, her face contorted in anger, she aimed her ire at me. "What the hell is your problem? He's just a kid." A deathly silence enveloped the aisle, and I could hear a pin drop as the other customers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and the mother. I could feel my cheeks flush with heat. After all, I was just trying to help. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just a typical grocery store visit anymore, it had turned into something much darker. "He's out of control," I stammered, my voice wavering slightly under the weight of her gaze. "Maybe if you paid attention." But before I could finish my sentence, the boy reappeared behind her, that same twisted grin plastered across his face, but this time, it felt like a veil of malice had descended over the air. "Don't you think she began, but the boy suddenly lunged at me, tackling my legs and causing me to stumble back, the world tilting as I hit the hard floor. My hands instinctively shot out to catch myself, pain sparking up my palms. Glaring up at the ceiling, I caught a glimpse of the kid running toward the entrance, laughter dancing on his lips, echoing in the empty space like a haunting memory. "Get him," I shouted, my voice hoarse as I regained my footing, but my cries were lost in a cacophony of chaos, the mother just standing there in shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It was surreal, feeling powerless as the crowd around us erupted into confusion, and I felt a sick realization washing over me. I had crossed a line, had intervened where I should have simply walked away. With each passing moment, tension thickened the air, and soon, I felt the terror of this bizarre scenario settle deeply in my gut. Crazily enough, it all seemed to happen in slow motion. I dashed after the boy just as he slipped out the glass doors, the cool night air hitting my face like a wave of clarity, and my heart pounding in my chest as I shouted again, "Stop." He raced toward the parking lot, the glow of headlights flickering erratically, but just as I was about to reach him, a strange sensation washed over me, some primal instinct screaming to run away. And then it happened. I caught a glimpse of his eyes, darker than the night itself, seeming to draw in all the light around him, and I felt my body freeze, paralyzed in fear as if some unseen force was holding me in place. "You can't stop me," he said, the childish lilt of his voice twisted into something unrecognizable, and in that moment, I could swear I saw a flicker of malice, no, a flicker of something far worse, deep within him that confirmed my worst fears. This child was not just out of control, there was something inherently wrong with him. Every instinct screamed for me to turn and flee, to escape the darkness that threatened to engulf me, but I was rooted, lost in those eyes that shone with an ancient malevolence, an echo of something that should never belong in a child. I felt the wind whispering warnings to me, but the moment I finally turned to run, I felt a sharp pain straining through my back. Looking down in disbelief, I realized that the boy, I don't even know how, was suddenly upon me, and he had stuck a butcher knife into my side, the world swiftly fading into a crimson haze as pain engulfed my senses. Everything became muffled and distant, the screams, the sirens, the horrified gasps of passers-by became a bizarre symphony, swelling as I crumpled to the ground, the cool concrete cradling me as I gasped for breath, caught in an inescapable nightmare. As I lay there, eyes flickering shut against an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole, I could hear the mother call out to him, "David, come back." But her voice sounded far away, as if it belonged to another world. In my fading moments, my mind was a whirlpool of regrets, of could-haves and should-haves, realizing too late that when the line between innocence and darkness blurs, it is often the innocent who pay the ultimate price. All I started with was a simple commentary on parenting, and now I was just another casualty in a tale nobody would believe. When I married Derek, I knew right from the start that I'd have to navigate the murky waters of his past. After all, his ex-wife, Lisa, hadn't just exited his life like some forgettable chapter. She was a ghost that lingered in every conversation, in the decorations of our shared home that sometimes felt like borrowed nostalgia, and most importantly, in the shadow of her new wife, Anna, who, as odds would have it, turned out to be someone who had an unsettling tendency to insert herself into our lives. It all came to a head one gloomy afternoon in early November, when Derek and I had just settled into our weekend routine of lazy brunch and Netflix. My phone buzzed with a message from Lisa, and I braced myself for the usual pleasantries, some innocent inquiry about the kids, maybe, but as I opened the text, I found Anna's name splattered across the screen. "I heard you don't want to meet me." "That's okay, I understand your feelings." It rattled me, and I tried to shove the inexplicable anxiety down, telling myself it was merely a misguided attempt at something resembling friendship. The truth was, the more I read about Anna, the new wife in a life that should have been severed from Derek but wasn't, the more I could feel the small hairs on the back of my neck prickle, sharper than any ghost's whisper, and it wasn't long before my polite refusals morphed into something darker. I told Derek I didn't want to meet her. He frowned as if he was about to argue, and years of marital negotiations played out in my mind, but thankfully, he kept his mouth shut, a shift I accepted, thinking perhaps he was on my side after all, until one fateful Friday night when the walls felt too thin and the shadows seemed to breathe. I woke in the middle of the night to a banging sound, loud and urgent, enough to rattle the very foundations of our home, but panic surged through me when I realized the noise was coming from the back door, where our kitchen met the dim alley behind our condo. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the sound, heart hammering in my chest, but just as I reached for the door, a figure darted into the darkness, a fleeting glimpse that caught my breath, Anna, standing there for just a second before vanishing into the abyss, and I swore I could taste her defiance in the air, a bitter tang tinged with a sense of ownership that made me feel as if she was daring me to come out and play. All the warning bells were clanging in my mind. One moment, I felt frozen, and in the next, I was racing back to my bedroom, where Derek slept soundly, blessedly unaware of the chaos of women that seemed determined to ruin our lives. Days passed in a surreal blur, where Anna's shadow loomed larger, and I came to know my own home as a battlefield. I began to hear whispers when no one was around, felt prying eyes watching through curtains when the sun went down, and every so often, I'd catch sight of a figure disappearing into the corner of my vision in the dimly lit spaces of our life. It got to the point of paranoia. I convinced myself Anna was playing some cruel game, trying to push me into a confrontation that, for her, would be thrilling, as if my refusal to engage with her was some sort of challenge she was determined to win. I lashed out at Derek more than ever, accusing him of being too close to his past, a ghost silently haunting our house even during daylight hours. But as it often goes in life, I soon learned that my sleepless nights came at a cost. One rainy afternoon, I received a surprise visit from Derek's sister, Rachel, well-intentioned, but her chatter about family gatherings, during which Anna had been graciously invited, felt sharp, like a knife twisting in my gut. It was on the tip of my tongue to unleash the devils I'd been keeping close, but I bit down murkily, burying my grievances underneath polite smiles, and yet my mind wandered back to Anna, worrying and careful like a spider spinning a web that seemed to ensnare us all in its delicate but unforgiving threads. When I finally reached my breaking point, it was during a dinner party, where the corny ambience of laughter and clinking glasses masked the war raging in my heart. Derek's family, including Lisa, stood in our backyard under twinkling fairy lights, and as if summoned by dark magic, Anna appeared, lovely in an ethereal way that cut into my self-worth like a knife. She greeted everyone breezily, and the taunting gleam in her eyes while she exchanged pleasantries with Derek felt like high stakes. Couldn't they see that she was here to replace me? That I would ultimately become just another piece in a twisted puzzle built on miscommunication and misunderstanding? As I stepped outside, my heart raced cold in my chest. I realized something had to give. In the very first moment I tried to confront her, adrenaline coursing through my veins, things spiraled faster than I could comprehend. "I don't want to talk to you," I asserted a bit too loudly, well aware that the party had all but faded into the background of our confrontation, glances darting between us as if we were the main event. But Anna just laughed lightly, brushing her hair back and holding my gaze with a fierce confidence that knocked wind out of me. "Why do you refuse? You don't have to be so afraid, you know. There's enough room in this life for all of us." Those words hung in the air like a curse, and an inexplicable dread gripped me, transforming my knees into gelatin. My refusal solidified into some sickening reality, that I was terrified, yes, terrified of this woman, this specter of Derek's past and the embodiment of a person who wouldn't just let go. She wanted to stake her claim, and here I was on trial for an invisible crime, sentenced simply for existing next to a ghost. Their laughter felt like a mocking eulogy to a life I had desperately tried to forge, and the air turned thick with tension, so palpable that I could likely cut it with a butcher's knife. It overwhelmed me until the needs for confrontation morphed into something twisted, darker. I wasn't just refusing to meet her, I was staring into a chasm, both terrified and intoxicated by the possibility of falling right in, resisting the call of something sinister I couldn't articulate. And then, just like that, it happened. The lights flickered overhead, plunging us into a surreal dance of shadows before a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated Anna's face, and in that single flicker, her grin twisted into something malicious, the kind that made my heart pound. The conversation fell silent, as if the world could feel the tremor of impending doom, and in that moment, I knew something in me snapped. I couldn't just refuse to acknowledge her anymore. The fear that had been simmering transformed into sheer defiance, something wild and unrestrained. With a smirk, I stepped forward into the abyss, ready to confront the specter that had taken over my life, but the response from Anna was chilling. She took a step back, eyes wide and retreating. It was then I realized I'd become more than just a new player in a game of old lovers. I'd become something darker, something powerful that didn't intend to share. In that strange moment of clarity, with my newfound conviction, I finally understood the horror that wasn't found within Anna's taunts or sneers, but within my own reflection warped within a fragmented mirror of shared pasts and futures. I was battling not just for myself, but for Derek, and the life we had built, and as Anna retreated under the gaze of our onlookers, I couldn't help but wonder, was I really prepared for what I had awakened? What dark consequences awaited us all? The space shimmered with unspoken words and unresolved fears, each person witnessing the birth of a new tension, and amidst it all, that question echoed endlessly in my mind, AITA for refusing to talk to my husband's ex-wife's wife? But truthfully, maybe it was time to discover what lay beneath the surface, to revisit every last secret buried in the darkness that would ultimately either free us or consume us. When I first moved into my tiny two-bedroom apartment with Clara, I was excited to finally have a place of my own, an escape from the oppressive atmosphere of my childhood home. Clara was friendly and welcoming, and we bonded over our shared love of late-night baking marathons and binge-watching true crime documentaries. Everything was great until one evening, when I got home late after a long shift at the diner and decided to whip up a batch of cookies to unwind. The smell of chocolate chip dough rising in the oven felt like home, familiar and comforting, but just as I pulled the tray out, Clara's voice cut through the sweetness of the moment. "Can we talk?" she asked, her expression serious, which struck me as odd. I set the warm cookies on the cooling rack and sat down at the small kitchen table, eager to hear what was bothering her. Clara lowered her voice, as if someone might overhear us, and said, "I need you to promise me you won't use the oven again." My heart dropped, the request clawed at my mind, a bone-chilling whisper of unreasonableness. "What? Why?" I asked, incredulous. You just can't," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Every fiber of my being wanted to dismiss her, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Is this about your weird family back home?" I pressed, remembering the odd traits she'd shared, like her great-grandfather's obsession with farming the land even after moving to the city. Clara's gaze suddenly turned distant, like a clock unwinding. "It's for your own good," she said quietly, and that's when I noticed how her hands were clenched into tight fists, her knuckles white against the faded oak of the table. I tried to reason with her, tell her that in all my previous apartments, I'd always used the oven, it was essential, the heart of my culinary dreams. But Clara remained firm, almost fearful. So, night after night, I reluctantly complied. My meals became monotonous, leaning heavily toward microwave dinners and takeout, leaving the oven untouched and the rich aroma of baked goods locked away in my yearning heart. I could feel the tension building, so I decided to do some digging and looked through the boxes Clara had left unpacked since the move. I found an old, dust-covered cookbook bound in frayed leather that caught my attention, dog-eared and marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize. Flicking through pages, I discovered handwritten notes and a hurried scrawl that spoke of rituals, of family traditions lost to time, and warnings against the oven being a portal of sorts, a gateway for something sinister. That night, I tentatively approached Clara as she flicked through channels, eyes glazed, and asked her about the cookbook. Her face turned pale, she snatched it from my hands, growling, "You shouldn't have looked at that." I recoiled, and she suppressed a sob as if she were about to spill secrets wrought with anguish. "What is happening, Clara?" I urged, but she shook her head in the manner of a child being lectured, whispering about how the oven shouldn't be used, how it belonged to a legacy far darker than we could comprehend. As the days dragged on, wrapped in her escalating mania, I finally lost my patience. It was a Thursday night, and I needed to bake something, anything, to reclaim my sanity. I woke up in the dead of night with an insatiable hunger for something freshly baked. Quietly, I crept into the kitchen, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and leaned over the counter where my food scale and mixing bowls lay patiently. Ignoring my better judgment, I started to gather my ingredients. I turned the oven knob, feeling a sense of rebellion surge through me, and that beautiful glow flickered to life, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. As I mixed together the batter, I could have sworn I heard something in the distance, a whisper echoing from deep within that old cookbook. The moment my cookies started to brown, the shelves rattled under an invisible force. Confusion flooded my senses, maybe it was an earthquake, or perhaps Clara had returned. But as I peeked through the window into the deep ink of midnight, I saw her. She was standing in the darkness of the courtyard, her back to me, whispering in a language that was sharp and foreign. I felt the door swing open behind me, a gust of wind that carried Clara's scent, something floral yet cold, like autumn leaves. I spun around, heart pounding, only to find the oven door flung wide open, steam billowing out like ethereal smoke. As I leaned forward, horrified, I noticed that my beautifully baked cookies had transformed into grotesque, burnt shapes, almost as though they were alive, broken shells shrieking silently in my mind. A low growl reverberated from the oven, the temperature surged, and the shadows coalesced into a swirling mass. The realization hit me swiftly. Clara had been keeping me from using the oven for a reason, a warning cloaked in paranoia. I reached for the cookbook, my fingers trembling, but Clara appeared behind me, her face twisted, fury and sorrow etched into her features. "You weren't supposed to see," she shrieked, and as I turned, the shadows seemed to reach out, lunging toward her. She stumbled backward, nails clawing at the wooden floor, a scream pouring from her lips as the darkness enveloped her. I was frozen in shock as she was dragged into the abyss of the oven, the growls intensifying, final echoes of her terror haunting the air. I blinked and found myself alone, the kitchen illuminated eerily by the oven's light. The cookbook lay open on the table, words shifting like quicksand, warning me, never again. My heart raced as a burning rage ignited within me. Yet, the overwhelming dread remained. I staggered back, staring at the melted remnants of the cookies that felt like pieces of souls. I stumbled out of the kitchen, breath quickening, feeling Clara's absence like a chasm in my chest. I don't think I will ever truly understand what happened that night. Days passed, and I couldn't bring myself to open the oven again. I lived off cold meals, the silence echoing in the apartment, and every time I caught a glimpse of the cookbook, its call now tainted with dread, I felt a presence lurking within its pages. I've tried to move on, but whispers follow me, warning me that the oven's portal is still alive, a void waiting to swallow more. Now, every time I hear a knock on my door or see a shadow dart in the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder if Clara is still out there. I still hear her voice sometimes, calling softly, begging for help against the darkness, a darkness I helped unleash by breaking a promise. So, here I am, AITA for wanting to use the oven, or is she still watching from whatever realm those shadows had taken her to, forever reminding me of what the oven truly holds? It was just supposed to be a casual night in with my friends, sitting on the couch while we binge-watched old horror movies and made jokes about the cheesy effects, but everything shifted when Lynn, my closest friend, leaned in with a mischievous grin and said, "You know, watching you two is like watching a really intricate roleplay," and for a split second, I started laughing, not because I thought it was true, who would seriously think that? But more because the idea struck me as absurd, like something ripped from the pages of a bad fanfiction. My boyfriend, Jake, chuckled too, more out of awkwardness than agreement, but when I looked at Lynn, her expression changed from playful to something darker, almost predator-like, and in that moment, I felt a chill skitter down my spine. I shrugged it off, dismissing it as one of her quirky comments at first, but the laughter died in the air, replaced by a heavy silence. I didn't realize it then, but my laugh had unearthed something buried deep within the group, like invoking a slumbering spirit at a seance. The night progressed, filled with laughter over bad jump scares and popcorn fights, but every so often, I'd catch Lynn staring at me through the flickering light of the TV, her gaze intense, almost conspiratorial. As the clock struck midnight, the final film ended, leaving echoes of creepy music lingering in the air, and we all decided to call it a night. I started cleaning up the mess, tossing empty snack bags into the trash while Jake and Lynn chatted in the corner, and I could tell something was off. Lynn's smile had morphed into a smirk, and I felt that familiar unease prick at my skin, a sense I couldn't quite shake. Later, as Jake and I were getting ready for bed, I joked about Lynn's comment, playfully nudging him, maybe we should, spice things up a bit? But he didn't laugh. Instead, he frowned, his brow furrowing. What did you mean by that? He asked, and I felt a rush of confusion. Wasn't we on the same page? I told him I was kidding, but then he shifted closer, scanning my face. You didn't take her seriously, did you? The weight of his gaze pierced through me, and a strange dread curled in the pit of my stomach as I denied it, even as I recalled the glint in Lynn's eyes. The next day, Lynn's texts were as animated as always, but beneath the surface, I could sense something off, like frayed wires on a live circuit. When I met up with her later, I tried to broach the subject lightly, but she dismissed my concern, her laughter ringing too loud, too haunting. The following months became a looping nightmare, where I'd catch Lynn watching me with an intensity that made my heart race, each encounter steeped in an unsettling tension I couldn't comprehend. I'd hear whispers behind my back, hushed tones between Jake and Lynn whenever I left the room, and Jake had begun to change too, his jovial demeanor shadowed by an underlying paranoia that echoed my own. Our intimate conversations grew strained, and he started to echo my own worries back at me. Was Lynn really just a friend, or had I become a pawn in their twisted game? The realization that Lynn had crossed a boundary I didn't fully grasp gripped me like a vice, and unease morphed into outright dread as I pieced together that her ramblings about roleplay might not have been innocent at all. One fateful night, driven by a mix of fear and determination, I decided I had to confront Lynn. I needed to know what was going on behind her mask of friendship. I invited her over, pretending to keep the atmosphere light, yet when she arrived, I could feel the storm brewing beneath our pleasantries, her laughter shrill and forced as I coiled my fists against my trembling legs. What did you really mean when you said we were role-playing? I pressed, and her expression flipped from playful to predatory, the corners of her mouth curling into that tight-lipped smile I'd come to dread. Oh honey, she said, her voice sickly sweet, you're the one playing a part, but the script was never given to you. You're just too naive to see it. My heart raced as I felt the air grow thick with something so palpable, it bordered on tangible. Every warning bell I had ignored screamed in my head, and I tried to excuse myself, to reclaim my sanity, but as I turned to the door, I could hear her murmuring my name, each syllable laced with something darker. The following week twisted into a surreal nightmare. I started to see shadows cast from my past interactions with both women seep through the cracks of my whitewashed reality, memories warped and rewritten. I catch Jake staring blanks at his phone, brow furrowed, whispers weaving like spider silk between Lynn's oddly timed texts and his own responses, and the intimacy we had shared dwindled to cold, vacant exchanges. I tried talking to him about it, about how Lynn was siphoning energy between us like we were puppets strung along by her whims, but each time, he'd grow defensive, lashing out as if my concerns were unfounded, and I found myself backed into a corner, racked with doubt, as if I was losing both my boyfriend and my own sense of reality. On a particularly agonizing night, exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed into a restless sleep, plagued by eerie dreams where I was an actor trapped in a puppet show, a caged bird pecked at by invisible threads pulling me into darker depths. I awoke with a start, and for a fleeting moment, the haze of the dream lingered, and I felt compelled to check my messages. The screen glowed eerie in the dark, and as I scrolled through the texts, dread coiled like a serpent around my heart when I discovered an unexpected text from Jake, "Meet me at the old playground," and the timestamp sent a shiver down my spine. It was sent during the night while I'd been dreaming. My heart pounded in my chest as questions overwhelmed me. Had they been plotting against me? What role had I been cast in? I grabbed my keys, driven by an impulse that propelled me forward, the shadows closing in like a muffled silence. The playground loomed in the distance, cloaked in darkness, and each step felt heavy, weighed down by foreboding whispers. As I arrived, the air turned thick and clammy, veiled in a chilling mist that whispered my name. Jake. I called, but the night swallowed my voice whole. I turned, searching every silhouette under the moonlight, and then I saw her, Lynn, standing there, and in a heartbeat, I froze, terror gripping my throat as I felt an icy blast of realization. It wasn't Jake waiting for me, it was her, and the glint in her eyes confirmed the role I had unknowingly stepped into was far from innocent. "You finally made it," she said, her voice a twisted serenade that shattered my resolve. "I've been waiting for you." The darkness enveloped me, and I was left suspended in a nightmarish tableau, understanding too late that the laughter I once shared had been merely the haunting echo of a sinister game I never wished to play. I never imagined I'd be embroiled in a battle of morality with my sister, especially not after a long day that started with the usual chaos of life with my own kids. But my phone rang in the middle of a meeting, and it was like my heart stopped when I saw her name. "Sarah never calls unless it's an emergency. You need to come to the school now," she snapped, and it felt like ice water poured into my veins. "What's happening?" I asked, dread crawling under my skin like a swarm of ants. "It's Liam. He's waiting for me, and I forgot to pick him up." In that moment, the world around me blurred, my mind replayed the image of my sweet, innocent nephew, all big brown eyes, and that shy smile, waiting all alone in a cold, unwelcoming cafeteria long after the bell had rung. I felt a surge of rage and disbelief. How could she leave him there? "You put your phone on Do Not Disturb? Are you kidding me?" I yelled, my voice rising in disbelief. She dismissed my concern with a wave of her hand, as if this was just a minor inconvenience. "It's just a kid. He'll be fine until I get there," she responded too casually, shrugging her shoulder as if it was no big deal that her first grader was more vulnerable than a single light bulb flickering in a pitch-black room. I was enraged, imagining that little boy, staring at those doors, waiting for the only adult who he thought would pick him up, and instead, feeling the creeping realization that he'd been forgotten. My voice echoed through the phone, louder and sharper than I intended. "You need to stop acting like this is acceptable behavior. What kind of person just leaves their child behind? What are you thinking?" And as soon as I said it, I felt a chill run down my spine as if something sinister was watching from the shadows. I drove to the school, every nerve ending in my body aflame with anxiety, imagining all the worst-case scenarios, the cruelty of older kids, the indifference of teachers, and the emptiness of that cafeteria. When I arrived, I burst through the doors. My sister was already there, but it wasn't her face I was looking for, it was my nephew. My heart raced as I scanned the space, and then I spotted him at a corner table, head resting on crossed arms, a pathetic, lonely figure surrounded by the echoes of laughter from children who had long since reunited with their parents. "Liam!" I called out, my breath hitching as he looked up, his tear-stained cheeks sending a dagger through my heart. He sprinted to me, wrapping his little arms around my waist as if I were the last lifeline in a drowning sea, and I couldn't hold back my own tears. "Why didn't Mommy come?" he whispered, his voice thick with confusion. I couldn't answer, as rage bubbled up anew along with maternal instinct. I turned to Sarah, my voice low but fierce. "How could you do this to him?" But the confrontation was interrupted by the school principal, a stern gaze beneath her thick glasses. "I really need to speak with you both," she said, and her tone suggested this was more than just a simple late pickup. We were ushered to her office where she would reveal a deep concern for Liam's well-being, her voice grave. "We've had reports of disturbing incidents in the area lately," she said, and my blood turned to ice. "Children have gone missing after school hours." My heart dropped as the implications sank in, visions of what could have happened to Liam racing through my mind like a runaway train. I looked at Sarah, her face pale as she glanced at Liam, who now stood wide-eyed, oblivious to the danger that could have befallen him. "I didn't know," she finally gasped, the reality of her negligence crashing down with the weight of 1,000 boulders. Everything changed in that moment. I could see her fear reflected in Liam's face, and it was then that I understood. She wasn't just careless, she was lost in a world of her own, one that wouldn't allow her to hear the tiny voice of her son, or the muffled cries for help of countless others trapped in their phones or their own minds. The principal continued, "Children need their parents more than ever, especially during these times." As she explained more about the cases in the area, I felt the air grow thick around us, suffocating. I had imagined a confrontation filled with shouting and blame, but instead, we were faced with the reality that we weren't just failing ourselves but the very ones we sought to protect. My anger morphed into deep sadness, the kind that grips you and doesn't let go, leaving room only for fear. My accusations hung in the air heavy, yet silent, while all I could hear was Liam's soft breaths and the distant voices of children still laughing outside, oblivious to the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. What haunted me then was the realization that perhaps, long before this incident, Sarah didn't just need me to yell. She needed me there, to guide her and Liam from whatever darkness she had fallen into, and that made me angrier than the reckless act itself. The principal's voice faded into a blur, warnings turning into echoes, while I held Liam close, swaying gently in a world now filled with shadows, not knowing if we'd ever truly be free of the hidden fears that lurk behind our screens, threatening to dissolve the fabric of our most sacred connections. How much longer could it go on like this?